This story that we've just read with Naaman is a story that's is filled with irony. For one thing, we have this great general, right? A great man, a general, a leader of armies. And yet, he's a man with a terrible skin disease. We have a great man who should be able to do whatever he needs for himself because of his money and his power and everything else. And yet it's the slave girl, a weak slave girl of his wife who was captured by him, who's able to tell him of how he might get healed. There's an outsider, that's Naaman. There's an outsider who seems to lack any real faith in God or that he really can be healed. And yet he's the one that gets healed. And we don't read it today, but at the end of the story, Elijah's right-hand man, a man who's the model of faithfulness to God, ends up acting disloyally and ends up with Elijah cursing him with the skin disease. The insider is not healed, but the outsider does get healed. And by the way, we can't forget that this man who gets healed by Elisha, he's the general of the Arameans. In other words, he's the man who came in and conquered Israel. He's the man who has been oppressing Elisha and his people, and yet it's Elisha and his people who bring wholeness and restoration to Naaman. This story of Naaman gets overlooked far too often on Sunday mornings because it doesn't have the glitz of chariots of fire, right? It doesn't have the excitement of raising a child from the dead, these other stories that we find in 2 Kings. But what we lack in glitz, we make up for in intrigue. It is both a theological story about faith, and yet it's also a story that's about the messiness, the politics, the reality of being human beings, being imperfect and messy and sometimes just messed up. Listen to what it says here in verses 5 through 8. Then Aram's king said, "Go ahead, I'll send a letter to Israel's king." So Naaman left. He took along 10 kikars of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. He brought the letter to Israel's king. It read this: "Along with this letter I'm sending you my servant Naaman, so you can cure him of his skin disease." When the king of Israel read the letter, he ripped his clothes. He said, "What? Am I God to hand out life and death? But this king rapes me, asking me to cure someone of a skin disease. You must realize that he wants to start a fight with me." The king of Israel is looking at this from the human point of view only, right? He sees a potential political mess and he's trying to avoid it with all of his might. The mess may not seem obvious to us, but it was very real to him. The king of Israel is all that's really left out of what was a great nation. He's barely holding on to some semblance of power. A mighty king who's already come and destroyed them once sends in his general and says, "Heal my man." The Israelite king is not an idiot, folks. In his experience, from what he knows of life and living, kings can't just wave their hands and make leprosy go away. I mean, he can try, and he can fail, and that will probably make the Arameans attack him. Or he could just say, "I can't do that. I'm not powerful enough for that." And he'd be admitting that he doesn't have any real power and that God might not be on his side. And then guess what? The Arameans will attack him and he's going to be conquered. Do you see what the Israelite king sees now? The truth is that may be exactly what the Aramean king was trying to do. When we read the letter, if we look carefully at the scripture, the slave girl clearly tells her mistress that there is a prophet in Samaria who can perform this miracle. Yet the king's letter curiously doesn't mention anything about a prophet. The king's letter from from Aram, just says to the king of Israel, "Heal my man." At the very least, the king of Aram is not being very helpful. At worst, he's being deceitful and trying to pick a fight. We don't know for sure what any of the intentions are here. I'm not trying to rewrite the Bible. But if we look at it from the Aramean king's perspective, what's it hurt? I send my general to the Samaritans, and either he gets healed and I have a stronger and better general, or he doesn't, and I will go in, I'll go back to war, and I'll be a hero again. For the Aramean king, it's a win-win situation. The story doesn't say what the king's intentions are. Both kings, though, are only looking at the situation from positions of impossibility. They were looking for failure, and it tends to be that when we look for failure, when we're looking for what's not possible, that's exactly what we get. But a slave girl who's been captured from Israel, who is now working for this general's wife, this young, weak slave girl is looking at the situation through the eyes of possibility. This young slave girl is looking at the world in an impossible situation and is able to get a glimpse of God's salvation in the midst of trouble and pain. She looks at the world with eyes filled with faith and hope. And she sees a situation where God can triumph and possibilities remain.